Agent Taylor woke up to a quiet, ordinary morning. The sun barely peeked over the horizon as the small town came to life, its residents beginning their daily routines. For Taylor, the day promised to be like any other, mundane, unremarkable, but full of potential. She made her coffee, dressed in her usual attire, a sleek black jacket, fitted trousers, and polished boots, symbols of her dedication to her work as a federal agent. Her duties often required subtlety, precision, and a steady hand. But today, something in the air felt different. The house was calm, too calm. She could hear the faint hum of traffic from the nearby highway, the chirp of distant birds, and the quiet buzz of life starting up again. She checked her phone, read a few messages from her colleagues, and mentally mapped out her day ahead. There was a briefing scheduled, then a couple of interviews, some routine paperwork, but nothing out of the ordinary. As she sat down to eat a quick breakfast, she couldn't shake the feeling that the town was holding its breath. There had been whispers for weeks, rumors of tensions between certain law enforcement officers and the community. Officer Grant, a local cop, had been making headlines lately. Known for his abrasive nature and controversial opinions, Grant had earned a reputation in town for his aggressive approach to policing, especially when it came to people of color. Taylor had heard the murmurs, seen the posts on social media, and felt the tension that lingered just beneath the surface. But today, she couldn't allow herself to dwell on it. She had a job to do, and her role was to serve and protect, to be the calm in the chaos. Still, as she left her house, locking the door behind her, she noticed something, an unfamiliar car parked down the street, its windows tinted too dark for comfort. For a split second, her instincts flared up, but she dismissed the thought. She was overthinking it. After all, she was just another federal agent going about her day in a sleepy town. But little did she know, this was no ordinary day. As Taylor drove down the main road, her mind wandered briefly to the incidents she had investigated in the past, the corruption she had uncovered, the dangerous people she'd crossed paths with. This was different, though. Today, the storm was brewing. And Taylor had no idea that her life was about to change in an instant. Officer Grant had been patrolling the streets for years, always following his own set of rules. While many in the community turned a blind eye to his behavior, others whispered about his tendency to target people who didn't fit his narrow view of acceptable. He was a figure of authority, revered by some, feared by others. But behind the badge was a man who believed that power over others was his right. Grant had always felt a sense of superiority, especially when it came to those he deemed outsiders or different. When he spotted Taylor's car that morning, he didn't think twice. He had seen her before. She was always dressed to the nines, exuding confidence, authority, and a quiet strength. He'd never gotten along with her. There was something about her calm demeanor that rubbed him the wrong way. He didn't know why, but something about her presence challenged his view of the world. As an officer of the law, he saw his role as enforcer of the town's order, a keeper of the status quo. And for some reason, Taylor had always been a thorn in his side. So when he saw her driving down the street that morning, he decided it was time to make his move. He pulled his cruiser up behind her car, his lights flashing as he got out. There was no real reason for the stop. Just a hunch, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. But in his mind, he was doing his duty. Taylor, however, knew something was off the moment he approached her vehicle. She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't even been speeding. Yet there he was, his stance already aggressive, his eyes narrowed. Taylor rolled down her window, her expression unreadable. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge. Grant didn't respond right away. He studied her for a moment, taking in her steady gaze. For some reason, this unnerved him. "You're being detained for questioning," he said abruptly. "Step out of the car." The command was harsh, without explanation, and Taylor's mind raced. There were too many unknowns in the situation. Her training kicked in, and she remained composed, assessing the situation in an instant. She knew her rights, knew the laws. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She could already feel the crowd beginning to gather behind them, the curiosity of bystanders growing. Taylor's eyes flicked to the people who were now recording the scene on their phones. The last thing she wanted was a spectacle, but it was too late. "Officer Grant, I'm not stepping out of the vehicle unless you have a valid reason," she replied, her voice firm but controlled. Grant's face twisted into a sneer. "You'll step out, or I'll make you," he retorted, his tone dripping with disdain. The power trip was obvious, and it stung. But Taylor held her ground. She knew this wasn't about the law, it was about him asserting control over her. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her cool. This wasn't the first time she had been wrongfully targeted, but this time felt different. There was something about the officer's attitude, his body language, that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She was certain this wasn't just an innocent traffic stop. Something else was at play here. "Don't make a mistake, Officer Grant," she said quietly, staring him down. "You have no reason to detain me. You're making a mistake." The words hung in the air between them, thick with tension. Grant hesitated, his hand twitching near his holster. The crowd had grown, murmurs filling the air, but all Taylor could focus on was the officer in front of her. She had no idea that this seemingly routine interaction would set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. Behind the facade of authority, Officer Grant harbored a deep, ugly secret, one that was about to collide with Agent Taylor's world in a way neither of them could have predicted. The arrest, the confrontation, the truth, it would all come rushing forward, and nothing would ever be the same again. The tension in the air was palpable. Officer Grant's eyes narrowed as he stood outside Agent Taylor's car, a slight scowl on his face. He had expected her to comply without question, as most people did when he made his demands. But Taylor wasn't like most people. There was something in her steady gaze, something unshakable, that made him second-guess his initial confidence. But only for a moment. He had the power here, and he wasn't about to back down. "You're stepping out of that car," he said again, his voice cold and commanding. He moved closer, placing a hand on the door as if to signal he was ready to drag her out. Taylor's heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from the recognition that this was no ordinary situation. She had been in tense situations before, but this felt different. She had seen the way Grant looked at her, like a problem to be solved, a challenge to his authority. She could feel the crowd behind her, their whispers carrying on the wind, their eyes glued to the confrontation unfolding. But her mind remained sharp, calculating. She couldn't let herself be baited. "Officer, I'm not going to argue with you," she said, her voice cool yet firm. "But I'm asking you once more, what's the reason for this stop?" Grant's lip curled into a sneer. "You're being detained for questioning, and that's all you need to know right now. Step out of the vehicle." Taylor could feel the eyes of the crowd pressing in on her, the heavy weight of being watched. She knew the risks. Every interaction with law enforcement had the potential to escalate in the wrong way, and that was something she couldn't afford. But this wasn't just any interaction. She wasn't about to let Officer Grant turn this into something bigger. "I'm not getting out until you give me a legitimate reason, Grant," she said, her voice unyielding. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel, her body bracing itself for whatever came next. The officer's jaw clenched, and for a split second, Taylor saw something in his eyes, an insecurity, a fleeting moment of doubt. He wasn't used to people standing up to him, not like this. He was the law in this town, the one who enforced the rules, and he wasn't about to be challenged. But he was also starting to realize that this wasn't just a random encounter. There was something about Taylor, something in the way she held herself, that made him uneasy. Without warning, Grant reached for the door handle and yanked it open. The sudden movement startled Taylor, but she kept her composure. Her eyes locked with his, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. It was just the two of them, each holding their ground. Taylor's mind raced. She could feel the anger bubbling up in her chest, but she knew she couldn't let it show. She had to stay calm, had to stay in control. "I said step out of the vehicle," Grant repeated, his voice now rising with frustration. Taylor exhaled slowly, her mind working quickly. She didn't want this to escalate into something physical. She could already see the video footage from the growing crowd flooding social media in real time, a viral sensation that would quickly paint her as the problem. But there was something else at play here, something that hadn't yet revealed itself. And Taylor could feel it. She knew Officer Grant had an agenda, and it wasn't just about a simple traffic stop. There was something personal behind this. She had to find out what it was. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what this is about," she said, her tone now more assertive. She kept her hand on the seatbelt, a subtle but strategic move that gave her an edge. Grant's eyes flicked over her, assessing. He had a decision to make, and for the first time in this exchange, he hesitated. A part of him knew this was a dangerous game to play. Another part of him was consumed by a simmering anger, a feeling that Taylor was challenging everything he believed in. He didn't want to back down, didn't want to show weakness, but he also knew he didn't have the full authority to make her get out of the car unless he had a valid reason. That's when his mind began to race, weighing the potential consequences of his actions. The crowd around them was growing, their phones raised, capturing every second. Murmurs spread through the onlookers, some sympathetic to Taylor's calm demeanor, others more wary of the officer's escalating aggression. The air felt thick with anticipation, and the longer the standoff went on, the more the tension mounted. Taylor was keenly aware of every shift, every movement. She had to stay calm. She couldn't let Grant win. "Grant, I know what you're trying to do," she said, her voice low but full of a quiet power. She wasn't going to let him drag her into a confrontation she didn't want. "This isn't about me being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is about you trying to make a point, and I'm not going to be your scapegoat." His eyes widened for a brief moment, as though she'd just hit a nerve, but he quickly masked it with a look of annoyance. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat. "Get out of the car, now." Taylor stared back at him, but she could see the cracks forming in his facade. His bravado was starting to crumble, replaced by a subtle but noticeable uncertainty. This wasn't going the way he had expected. He had expected her to back down, to comply with his authority. But Taylor wasn't the type of person who took kindly to being pushed around, especially not when there was something deeper at play. Suddenly, the officer's radio crackled to life. A brief moment of distraction, just enough time for Taylor to notice the shift in Grant's demeanor. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the device, his eyes darting nervously to the growing crowd. It wasn't just the public eye on him now. Taylor had caught him in a moment of vulnerability, and she could sense his discomfort. As Grant turned away to respond to the radio, Taylor's mind raced. She knew this wasn't just about an arrest. This was personal. But what was it about her that had triggered this? Why had Grant chosen this moment to escalate things? She could feel the weight of her secret pressing against her, and it gnawed at her in ways she hadn't anticipated. At that moment, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let him dictate the terms. She wasn't going to let him take control of this situation. Taylor had been preparing for moments like this, where a split-second decision could determine the outcome of everything. And she was ready. She took a deep breath, leaned forward, and turned the engine of her car on, startling Grant. As she slowly pulled away from the curb, the crowd began to murmur, unsure of what was happening. But Taylor didn't look back. The die had been cast. What had begun as an ordinary morning was now spiraling into something neither she nor Grant could control. The clash of wills had only just begun. And somewhere, hidden beneath the surface, was the secret that would unravel everything. As Taylor drove away, the tension still clung to the air like a heavy fog. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just transpired. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly escaped something much worse than a simple altercation with a local cop. The confrontation with Officer Grant had left her unsettled, but there was more beneath the surface. The way he had reacted, the way his aggression had quickly shifted to uncertainty, it all pointed to something deeper, something personal. She could feel it, like a silent warning echoing in her gut. She drove through the familiar streets of the town, each corner seemingly more claustrophobic than the last. The town felt smaller now, more suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on her. The usual hum of daily life seemed distant, muted. She was no longer just an agent going about her work. She had become a target, a person of interest in a situation that was quickly growing out of control. As she pulled into the parking lot of the federal building, she noticed the cars of her colleagues parked haphazardly, as if people had arrived in a rush. The atmosphere inside was no different, chaotic, tense. Her partner, Detective Marco, was pacing near the front entrance, his face etched with worry. When he saw her, he immediately approached, his voice low, urgent. "Taylor, what the hell just happened?" he asked. "You're all over the news. It's everywhere." Taylor didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. The expression on Marco's face said it all. He was both concerned and confused. Marco had always been a reliable partner, but even he couldn't understand the full scope of what was going on. And honestly, neither could she. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the rising anxiety in her chest. "You're being accused of resisting arrest," he said, lowering his voice even further as if afraid someone might overhear. "There are rumors, Taylor, people are saying you're involved in some kind of conflict with Grant. It's ugly. And I've been hearing some whispers about how he's looking for a way to take you down." Taylor's blood ran cold. Grant. Of course, it was him. She had known that there was something behind his actions earlier, but hearing it like this, out in the open, made it feel all too real. She had always known that Grant's views were toxic, but now it was clear that he was willing to go to great lengths to destroy her career, her reputation. He had started this, and now he was going to make sure it was a war. "We need to talk to the higher-ups," Marco continued, trying to catch her attention. "We can't let this escalate. If Grant's pulling strings, we're in deep. This could ruin you. It could ruin all of us." Taylor nodded, though her mind wasn't entirely focused on what Marco was saying. She was already piecing things together, analyzing the situation from every angle. She had been targeted. It wasn't just a matter of routine police work, it was a calculated attack. And Grant wasn't working alone. He had allies, people who shared his twisted worldview and would support his claims, no matter how unfounded they were. It wasn't just about a single arrest, it was about his pride, his power, and his ability to control anyone who challenged him. And she had challenged him. "I'm not backing down, Marco," she said quietly, her gaze hardening. "This goes far beyond some petty accusations. He's trying to ruin me, but I'm going to make sure he pays for it." Marco eyed her, concern still written across his face. "I get it. I do. But we need to tread carefully. You're walking into a minefield, and Grant's not the only one who's got something to hide." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Taylor's pulse quickened at the implication. There was more. Something deeper was at play here, and she needed to get to the bottom of it. "I don't care what it takes," Taylor said, determination in her voice. "I'm not letting him get away with this. I need to know everything. I need to know what he's hiding." Marco hesitated before nodding. "I'll help you," he said. "But we have to be smart about this. If we go after him without solid proof, it'll only give him more ammunition." Taylor took a deep breath, her mind already whirling with ideas. She knew Marco was right. This wasn't going to be easy. But there was something about this whole situation that felt like it was building towards something much bigger than just a power struggle between her and Grant. She could feel it in her bones. There was a secret, something Grant was hiding, and it was the key to everything. As the two of them sat down in the small, cluttered briefing room, Taylor pulled out her tablet and began scrolling through news articles, watching video clips that had already gone viral. The footage was everywhere, footage of Grant's aggressive behavior during the traffic stop, footage of her defying him, standing her ground. But what struck her wasn't just the incident. It was the way the narrative was being spun. Grant was being portrayed as the victim, as the one who had been disrespected and targeted by an out-of-control agent. There was no mention of his history, of the rumors surrounding him, of the way he had instigated the altercation. The entire town seemed to be siding with him, unaware of the twisted truth behind the scenes. As she watched the clips, her mind churned. She needed leverage. She needed to find a way to turn the tables. Her hand instinctively went to her holster, but she didn't draw her weapon just yet. There was no one visible. Not yet. She stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly as she crossed the threshold. The interior of the diner was as run down as the exterior, with cracked vinyl booths and a dusty counter where the chairs were stacked haphazardly. A single overhead light flickered sporadically, casting an unsettling glow over the empty space. Taylor scanned the room, her eyes darting from corner to corner, but there was no one in sight. Her heart beat faster, her senses sharpening as she waited for something to happen. Then she heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor behind her. She spun around, her hand reaching for her gun, but it wasn't Grant, or any other cop. It was a woman. A woman who was barely more than a shadow in the dim light, her features obscured by a dark hood pulled low over her head. "You came," the woman's voice was soft but firm, like a whisper of wind through the trees. It was hard to place, hard to identify. But it carried a certain weight, like she had been expecting Taylor all along. Taylor's gaze didn't waver. "You've got information. What do you know about Officer Grant?" The woman nodded slowly, stepping forward into the light. Her face was partially hidden, but Taylor could make out a few distinct features: sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, and an aura of someone who had seen things that others would never understand. The woman was no stranger to this world of shadows and secrets. "He's not who you think he is," the woman said quietly. "He's been hiding something for a long time. Something dangerous. Something that could ruin him if it ever comes to light." Taylor's pulse quickened. She stepped closer, her voice low. "What is it? What does he have on you?" The woman's eyes flickered with something dark, something she was reluctant to share. "It's not just me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not just about you either. Grant has been covering his tracks for years, hiding his connections. But one thing's certain, he's in deep. Deeper than anyone realizes." Taylor frowned, confusion clouding her thoughts. "What kind of connections?" The woman took a deep breath, as if gathering her strength. "You don't get to be a cop like Grant without making enemies. He's been working with people who have ties to organized crime, to shady deals, anything to keep his position. He's been using his badge to protect them, all while pretending to be a pillar of the community. But it's all falling apart now. He's panicking. And that's why he's going after you." Taylor's stomach turned. She had suspected Grant was hiding something, but this was more than she could have ever imagined. His connections to crime, the web he'd woven of lies and deception, it explained so much. It explained why he had been so quick to target her. He had something to protect, and he would stop at nothing to make sure it stayed hidden. But it wasn't just his reputation on the line. It was everything. If the truth came out, if people discovered what he was involved in, it would destroy his career, and it could ruin the lives of everyone he had been protecting. Taylor's mind spun with the implications. This wasn't just about taking down a corrupt cop. This was about exposing a much larger criminal network, one that stretched far beyond Grant. The woman's voice interrupted her thoughts. "I don't know how much longer I can stay safe. He knows I'm talking to you. And there are others out there who don't want the truth getting out. If you go after him, you're going to make powerful enemies. People who will stop at nothing to protect him, and themselves." Taylor's jaw clenched, her resolve hardening. "I'm not backing down. Not now. Not when I know the truth. Whatever it takes, I'm going after him." The woman gave her a sad, knowing look. "Then you're walking into a war, Taylor. And once you're in, there's no turning back." Taylor nodded, her mind already racing with plans and strategies. She had a war to fight now, one she hadn't chosen, but one she would finish. And Officer Grant would not win. He thought he could destroy her. But what he didn't realize was that she was already coming for him, and the truth would be his undoing. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and as Taylor stepped away from the woman in the diner, a new kind of clarity settled over her. She had crossed the line now. There was no turning back. Officer Grant had no idea what he had unleashed by going after her. What he saw as a petty personal vendetta had just become a much larger, much more dangerous game. He wasn't just facing a single agent. He was facing the truth, and the truth had a way of cutting through lies and deceit, no matter how carefully they were concealed. Taylor didn't know exactly how deep Grant's web went, but she was going to find out. Every shred of information, every clue she could gather, was a piece in a puzzle that would expose him for the monster he truly was. Her mind was racing as she stepped back into her car, the weight of what she had just learned heavy on her shoulders. Marco had been right. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everything Grant had built, his career, his allies, his criminal ties, and how far he was willing to go to protect it all. She had seen his desperation in the way he had treated her, but now she understood the true depth of it. He wasn't just a corrupt cop who could be taken down by exposing a few bad actions. No, he was embedded in something much darker. Something that could bring down a whole network if the right people knew. Driving through the empty streets, her thoughts kept spiraling back to that night, to the woman in the diner, to the cryptic words she had shared. "He's in deep," she had said. "A war is coming." The idea of Grant as part of a larger criminal syndicate seemed almost too monstrous to believe. How had he managed to fly under the radar for so long? How many people had turned a blind eye to his actions, either out of fear or ignorance? It was hard to comprehend, and yet it made perfect sense. In a town like this, where everyone knew everyone else's business, how had he managed to escape notice for so long? Taylor's mind continued to churn, and as she pulled into her driveway, she realized the full weight of the challenge ahead. There was no time to waste. Grant was dangerous, but so were the people he was connected to. And if she was going to take him down, she needed to be prepared. That night, she barely slept. The message from the diner echoed in her mind, and she replayed every conversation she had had with Grant in the past weeks, looking for signs she had missed. Every moment, every detail seemed more important now. Had there been any clues she had overlooked? Had he dropped any hints in his behavior, in his conversations, that might have suggested something more? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. She was already up, dressed, and ready for action. It was Marco. His face was pale, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. He stepped inside before she could respond, closing the door behind him. "I've been digging into Grant's background, and there's something you need to know." "You're right, he's not just some rogue cop. He's got ties to some serious people. I'm talking about people with power, people who can make things disappear. And they're not going to just roll over and let you expose him." Taylor nodded, her stomach tightening. This wasn't a fight anymore. This was a battle between two worlds, her world, where justice and truth mattered, and his world, where corruption and fear ruled. But Taylor wasn't backing down. She couldn't afford to. The evidence, the truth, it was all within her reach. "So what's the plan?" she asked, her voice steady, though she could feel the tension building. Marco hesitated before answering, glancing at the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "I've got a contact," he said, lowering his voice. "Someone on the inside. They've been watching Grant's movements for a while. They know about the deals he's been making, the people he's been covering for. If we can get to them, get the proof, we'll have everything we need. But it's going to be risky. We'll be walking right into the lion's den." Taylor's mind raced as she processed what Marco had just told her. If they could get the proof, everything could change. She could destroy Grant and his entire operation in one fell swoop. But it wouldn't be easy. Whoever this contact was, they were taking a huge risk by helping them. Grant had powerful friends, and those friends wouldn't hesitate to use violence to protect their interests. But Taylor was done playing it safe. She couldn't stand by and let Grant continue his reign of terror. She had seen the damage he had caused, not just to her, but to the people he had manipulated, the ones he had hurt, and the ones who had been too afraid to speak up. This was bigger than just taking down a bad cop. This was about exposing a system that had allowed him to thrive, to feed his power, to destroy lives without consequence. She couldn't stop now. "Where do we meet them?" she asked, her tone sharp, decisive. Marco looked at her, searching her face as if trying to gauge her readiness. "Tomorrow night. Same diner. I'll get the details, but we can't wait much longer. The longer we take, the more dangerous this becomes." Taylor nodded. She wasn't afraid anymore. She knew what needed to be done. And as much as she wished she could have a moment to breathe, to think, there was no time for that. The world she knew was crumbling around her, and all that mattered now was stopping Grant before he could destroy more lives. That night, Taylor went over her plan again and again, running through every possible scenario. She couldn't afford to make a single mistake. When the time came, she had to be ready. It wasn't just her career on the line now. It was her life, Marco's life, and the lives of everyone Grant had ever betrayed. She knew what she had to do. She just had to survive long enough to do it. When the next night came, she wasn't alone. Marco was by her side, watching her back, and they were both ready for whatever lay ahead. They would walk into that diner, find the truth, and take down Officer Grant. The battle for their lives, their futures, had only just begun. The road ahead would be filled with danger, deception, and betrayal, but it was a road they were both prepared to walk. No matter the cost, inside the diner, the air was thick with an unsettling stillness. The flickering lights overhead cast long shadows across the empty booths, and the faint smell of stale coffee lingered in the air, clinging to the peeling wallpaper. Taylor's footsteps echoed too loudly as she crossed the worn tile floor, her every movement precise, deliberate. The hum of the refrigerator behind the counter was the only other sound, and it seemed to grow louder with each step. She was acutely aware of the weight of her gun at her side, the cool metal pressing against her hip, reminding her of the dangers ahead. Her eyes scanned the room, empty, except for a lone figure sitting in a booth at the far corner, a shadow among shadows. It was him. The contact. Taylor's heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. She had been waiting for this moment, this chance to expose the truth. As she approached, the figure didn't look up. The man's face was obscured by the low brim of a baseball cap, and he kept his hands folded in front of him, his posture relaxed but alert. Taylor felt her instincts flare, urging caution. But she couldn't afford hesitation now. Not when she was so close. She slid into the booth across from him, her movements fluid, controlled. He looked up then, his eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't say anything immediately, just studied her, weighing her presence as if measuring whether she was truly ready for what she was about to hear. Taylor held his gaze, her expression hard, her resolve unshakable. After a long moment, he finally spoke. "You must be Taylor," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might cause someone to overhear. "You look like him. Determined. Stubborn." Taylor's jaw clenched at the mention of Grant. She had no time for pleasantries. "I came for the truth." "What do you know about him?" "About Officer Grant?" The man leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing as if evaluating whether she was prepared for the information he was about to drop. He exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting out the window as if considering how much to reveal. "You think you know what he's done. You think you can just walk in here and take down a man like Grant. But you're only scratching the surface. He's been working for years to protect himself, to cover his tracks, but it's deeper than you realize. You don't get to the top of the ladder without stepping on people, Taylor." Taylor's stomach tightened at the mention of Grant's climb to power. What kind of people? Who is he really working with? The contact's eyes flickered toward the door, his expression tightening. He looked back at Taylor with a deep, almost regretful look. "You don't understand. It's not just about protecting himself anymore. He's in too deep with the wrong people. People who have power, real power. And they've been using him for years. You think you're taking down one bad cop. But what you're about to uncover will bring down an entire system, a network that stretches across the city and beyond. Grant is just one piece. One very important piece, but just one. Taylor felt a chill spread through her veins. The gravity of the situation was beginning to sink in, and with it came the realization that what she had set in motion could have consequences far beyond what she had imagined. She had been focused so intently on Grant, on taking him down, that she hadn't fully processed what his involvement in this larger network meant. She had been fighting the wrong battle, at least, the one she had thought she was fighting. Her voice dropped to a low, steady tone. So what do I need to do? How do we expose him? The man leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table with an intensity that matched Taylor's. You need proof, real proof. Something solid enough to bring him down, to show the world who he really is. But it's not just about finding the evidence. It's about making sure you can use it. You're going to need people on your side. People who know how to navigate this world. People who can get you access to what Grant's been hiding. Taylor's mind raced. She had the drive, the determination, but this was bigger than just her. She needed allies, a network, people who could help her gain the leverage she needed. The clock was ticking, and every moment she hesitated, Grant was one step closer to finding out what she was doing. The urgency of it all hit her like a freight train. She couldn't do this alone. Who can I trust? She asked, her voice tight, a mix of urgency and fear in her gut. The man smiled faintly, his eyes glinting with something between admiration and caution. There are people. You'll know who they are when the time comes. But be careful, Taylor. Not everyone in this game plays fair. Some people will help you, others will try to stop you. And those who try to stop you? They're the ones who will hurt you the most. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Taylor felt a shiver run down her spine, but she didn't let it show. She was past fear now. This was war, and she wasn't going to back down. Where do I start? She asked, her voice steady, despite the storm raging inside her. The contact stood up, his eyes never leaving hers. You start by getting close. Close enough to make him trust you. Close enough to make him slip up. The deeper you get, the more dangerous it will be. But you're already in this deep. There's no way out. He turned toward the door, and for a moment, Taylor thought he was leaving. But he stopped and looked back, his expression darkening. One last thing, he said. Grant is dangerous. But he's not the worst of them. You haven't seen what they're truly capable of yet. If you thought this was just about a corrupt cop, you're in for a rude awakening. With that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Taylor in the quiet, dimly lit diner, the weight of his words sinking deep into her bones. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of adrenaline and dread twisting inside her. This was no longer just about taking down a corrupt officer. This was about exposing a criminal empire that stretched far beyond anything she had ever imagined. And as much as she wanted to see Grant fall, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the whole truth came to light. What would become of her? Of Marco? And of the city she had sworn to protect? She didn't have answers. But she had a job to do. And she was going to finish it. One way or another.